Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, The Building Blocks for Lifelong Learning. This morning we're going to discuss the findings of Infrastructure Victoria's most recent research, Learning for Life, Preparing Kindergarten, School and TAFE Infrastructure for the Future. My name's Jill Risley. I'm the Deputy CEO at Infrastructure Victoria, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Jonathan Spear, CEO at Infrastructure Victoria, and Llewellyn Renders, our Director of Policy and Research. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in Victoria, in particular the people of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we are here at Infrastructure Victoria. For those who are new to Infrastructure Victoria, we are the state's independent advisory body with three core functions. We publish original research on infrastructure-related issues. We prepare the 30-year infrastructure strategy for Victoria, which we review and update every 3 to 5 years. And we advise the Victorian Government on specific infrastructure matters. A couple of pieces of housekeeping before we begin. We have Slido for submitting questions, which we encourage you to do, and also a link to view the webinar with closed captions. Links to both of these are under the live stream on the website. I'll now hand over to Llewellyn to take us into some of the research.
Thank you so much, Jill. And hi, my name is Llewellyn Renders. I'm a Director of Research and Policy here at Infrastructure Victoria and worked with part of our team to develop this research. And to give you some background, Infrastructure Victoria was really interested in the future demand and need for education infrastructure in the state, and particularly the government's role in delivering that. And we've done a wide-ranging piece of research, particularly looking at the need for kindergarten infrastructure, the need for public school infrastructure, and the need for TAFE infrastructure in the future. And what we've found is that Victoria does need more education infrastructure where people can more easily reach it. And we've actually found that particularly in Melbourne's outer suburbs and new growth areas, and in some parts of regional Victoria, people have less in education infrastructure than in other parts of the state. Now, we know education infrastructure takes time to build, plan and deliver. You can't switch it on and off like a tap. And so how we grow in the future, where the need for education infrastructure will be, needs to be considered ahead of time so we have time to construct and understand where that infrastructure will need to be and put together the relationships and the most effective and efficient way of delivering that infrastructure so we can minimise the cost to the people of Victoria and provide a great education experience for every Victorian. And we know all of these sectors are a mix of providers. So we have both public, private and not-for-profit providers of education infrastructure in the kindergarten space, for schools and for vocational education. And those providers will meet some of the demand in the future for education infrastructure, and the Victorian Government doesn't need to build it all. But by focusing investment where it's needed most, the Victorian Government can make sure everyone gets great access to education infrastructure, but allow other sectors to do their fair share of construction and infrastructure delivery to minimise the costs overall to the state. And if we plan and invest ahead of time and particularly do things like buy new land early or ensure that we're facilitating the involvement of other sectors, we can deliver the education infrastructure Victoria needs and ensure that every child, young person and Victorian can get what they need from the education system. So just to run you through some of our key findings, and what we have found is we will need more education infrastructure in the future. We might need up to 60 new government schools, particularly in Melbourne's growth areas. We might need 900 new kindergartens kindergartens. And again, in a theme that might persist through this presentation, particularly focused in Melbourne's growth areas. We might need 125,000 square metres of new TAFE infrastructure in Melbourne and another 50,000 in regional Victoria. But these patterns change over time, particularly if we see more densification in Melbourne. So in the longer term, we might also need to think about expanding existing schools in inner and middle suburbs and in some regional centres. And we also know that how we build infrastructure will very much affect how much it costs. And for example, we know that if we build larger school designs in the future, particularly in Melbourne's growth areas, we might save up to $1.5 billion in the next 10 years. So to dig into the kindergarten sector, and I'll hand over to Jonathan in a moment to talk you through some of the others, but let's start at the beginning with kindergarten. And we know kindergarten is extremely beneficial to children and young people and their future over their lives. Children have better long-term learning, social and emotional abilities if they attend 2 years of high-quality education in kindergarten. And it especially helps children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And indeed, investment in early education delivers $2 for every dollar the government invests. And the Victorian Government has responded to these findings, and it is rolling out its Best Start, Best Life reforms. But the consequence of those reforms is there is growing and very strong demand for new infrastructure for kindergarten. As I mentioned earlier, kindergarten is provided by a range of different providers in the private sector, in the not-for-profit sector. It is provided by local government, and we've seen the Victorian Government announce that it will be a provider of early childhood and kindergarten facilities as well. When it comes to private and not-for-profit providers, they drive their investment in kindergarten. They decide where their services will be and how much they'll charge for them. And this affects the pattern of where kindergartens and early childhood infrastructure is delivered across the state. Now, we've done some modelling on future projections for where kindergarten infrastructure might be needed and tested different assumptions for who would provide it, be it state government, local government, not-for-profit or private providers. And similarly, we considered issues around where it might be provided, such as on government and non-government schools. And what those results really found is our estimate of around 900 new kindergartens required in the next 10 years. And if we add up the total cost, that is the total cost of building it all and the value of all the land that it sits on, that adds up to $17 billion. Now, I hasten to add that the government need not pay for all of that, and indeed there are many ways that the cost of that could be reduced. But where we look at where that demand is really occurring, it is in the growth suburbs of Melbourne's north, Melbourne's west and Melbourne's southeast. And we very much see that in the short term, Melbourne's new growth areas is really the pressure point, and those trends continue outwards. And the further we project out, the more Melbourne's middle suburbs come into play as well as requiring new kindergarten infrastructure. But when we look at some of our scenarios, and we looked at a range of different scenarios about who might provide this infrastructure in the future. If we take an extreme example where the Victorian Government pays for it all and it buys new land for all of that infrastructure, we see a cost to government of $17 billion. Whereas if we look back at how this sector developed historically, where the Victorian Government has a very small share and contributes relatively small amounts to other sectors to fund that infrastructure, the cost would only be $3 billion. But we've really looked at how it might play out under different scenarios to rapidly build a lot of infrastructure over the next 10 years, particularly as the new reforms roll out. So, for example, if we take a scenario where the Victorian Government partnered with local governments to roll out new kindergarten infrastructure in more disadvantaged areas of Victoria, we see a cost to the Victorian Government of around $6 billion. If we say, well, local government doesn't contribute to that, the Victorian Government covers all of those costs, including the costs of land, that is estimated at $11 billion. But the capital and operating costs of that infrastructure, so the buildings themselves, we estimate in those middle two scenarios will cost around $4 to $7 billion. And if the government needs to buy, it's only if the government needs to buy all of the land that those extra $2 to $4 billion come into play. And the wash up of this is when we look at the speed which we need to deliver the government's policy objectives and the constraints of government in funding new infrastructure, the role of the private sector and the not-for-profit sector is essential to delivering these reforms, which really means and really explains why our recommendations in this space really concentrate on how the government can facilitate the participation of those sectors in the rollout of new kindergarten infrastructure in the future. Because for the reforms to be a success and for every kid to get the 3 and 4-year-old kindergarten services, we think will be extremely beneficial for them and for Victoria in the future, the private sector and the not-for-profit sector need to be able to play their role. And our recommendations go to giving those sectors the confidence to invest. So our first recommendation is really about working with those sectors to facilitate markets and facilitate that investment in new infrastructure. So for example, the government can more regularly update information, tell the market where they're seeing the demand, where babies are being born, where they're living, and where that demand is likely to occur. Our second recommendation is also about the government being really transparent about where it's intending to invest. So we've suggested, for example, publishing the priorities for investment over the next 5 years. And that might not be detailed, site locations in the future, but really giving the private sector and the not-for-profit sector the confidence to understand that if it decides to invest, it's not going to be trumped by a government investment next door, potentially threatening the viability of that investment. So what we're really interested in seeing, and what will deliver the reforms, as well as make sure that limited government funds can be most effectively spent, is government investing where the private and not-for-profit sectors are unlikely to go, and really trying its best to stimulate the market, give it the confidence to invest in new infrastructure so that we can deliver these reforms in a timely way. But we're going to move on from kindergarten to the next stage of education, and I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to take you through some of our schools work.
Great, thanks very much, Llewellyn. Hi everybody, great to have you with us on this webinar, and it is the start of a new school year, so absolutely time for us to be moving from kinder to talk about our work on future planning for the school system. So our work is focusing on Victorian Government schools. There, of course, is important roles to play in other sectors that deliver schools as well, just as is in the case of kindergartens, as Llewellyn was just explaining. And of course, the clearer we can be about Victorian Government school planning intentions, the easier that's going to make it for independent and Catholic schools, for example. So The Victorian Government has had a commitment to open around 100 new schools and has been making pretty good progress in delivering on that commitment, but hasn't yet then announced what the next tranche of school investment will be. So that's one of the reasons we've done this work, is to inform the timing and the location of that work around the next investments for schools really over the next decade or so. Of course, all students have a guaranteed access to their nearest government school. But what we know is that some schools are certainly located in places that are more accessible for students and their families than others. And that accessibility of schooling is a key consideration that we have had in doing this work. Because if we don't construct schools both at the speed we need for our growing school population and the locations where they're going to be, that is going to really create an access problem for our students and their families. So we've done modelling about what future school demand there will be over the next couple of decades, so out to 2036 and to 2056. And just like the kindergarten, which Llewellyn has just explained, we've looked at that through a scenario-based approach, which I'm going to take you through because it gives us some interesting insights as to what the best pathways might be to deliver that initial and then further existing school capacity that we're going to need. So what we found is that a lot of the demand, around 95% of the demand, in fact, for more schools is going to be in those fast-growing areas of Melbourne's west, north and southeast. And of course, that's a very consistent pattern with what Llewellyn was just describing in relation to kindergarten demand as well. And that's not really a surprise when we look demographically at where the majority of young families and their children are locating and growing, where there aren't new schools already delivered as well. We certainly see in our modelling and estimates that there's likely to be need for expansion of more schools in the inner and middle suburbs of Melbourne as our communities grow. And that might be accelerated a little by the recent government announcements of seeking to have more of our population located in the inner and middle areas of Melbourne and our regional cities too. And at Infrastructure Victoria, we've done a lot of work that supports that as a policy direction. It has lots of benefits. It'll also mean that we need to be planning for growing school populations in the middle and inner suburbs of Melbourne. But having said that, really over the next decade, even if we are achieving those housing targets in established areas, the vast majority of our school demand and growth is going to have to be in our growth areas in the north, the west and the southeast of Melbourne. There's certainly also growth going on in some other areas outside Metro Melbourne. So particularly central and out of Geelong and around the Surf Coast, Warragul and the Macedon Ranges, we are seeing demand growing for school enrolments in those places too as our school population grows. But what our estimates and modelling show is that in those locations, we're likely to be able to accommodate those students on existing school grounds with expansion of school buildings on those school grounds, particularly in light of the big investments that government has made over recent years to deliver new schools in those areas. And if we can do that, if we can accommodate more students on existing schools, what that does is it frees up some of the government funding we have to instead invest in teaching and great learning environments instead of new land and new schools for more new schools. So that's a real benefit for students, the broader school community, and of course the staff who are working at those schools as well. So what we've done is we've modelled 5 different scenarios, and I'll explain these through. But what they tell us is that the best way to deliver schools over the next decade or so is to build larger new schools and to expand the existing schools that we have where we've got the land available to do so. And so that's why we're recommending that be the guiding principles as government looks to invest in new schools over the next decade. So on the left side of your screen, you can see the number of new government schools we think we'll need to deliver by 2036 in Victoria. And on the right is the cost of delivering each of those scenarios. And we've looked at things like the cost of building it, but also land cost and the operating costs of those schools. So the first scenario we've looked at is the historical scenario. So if we continue to build primary and secondary schools at the sort of size that historically in the past we have been doing. And if we do that, then we're going to need nearly 60 new schools. Contrast that with a scenario in which we maximise the ability of existing schools to accommodate more new buildings on the land that's available and also relocatable buildings on those schools. And what we've looked at in the modelling is some realistic estimates of what the limits are to putting new buildings on the land available in schools, but we find that we might have a considerably smaller number of new schools that are needed if we maximise the existing schools by putting more buildings on them. We might be getting to something like 37 new schools instead of nearly 60. Contrast that with a scenario in which we severely limit the amount of relocatable buildings that we place on our school grounds. If we do that, we'd be looking at over 100 new schools to deliver, and that's billions and billions of dollars of greater cost to deliver new schools that we wouldn't actually be able to invest in teaching and learning and staffing. Now, what that pulls out for us as insight, I guess, is the importance of relocatables as part of the mix of school buildings that we deliver. And when you dive into the report that's on our website, you'll find we've had a bit of a look at what do relocatable school buildings look like now? Because if you're extremely old like me, you might have a memory of, hot, sweaty, not particularly comfortable relocatable buildings in the 1980s. Happily, things have moved on since then, and so actually relocatable school buildings are a much better quality and teaching and learning environment now. And so they certainly have a place in the mix for the school buildings that we are delivering. The fourth scenario that we've looked at is making schools larger than they currently are, so having a larger number of students. So we're talking more like around 900 students at a primary school and around 2,000 students at a secondary school. And that's actually the sizes that the Department of Education have started to be delivering with some of their newer growth area schools. And what our modelling shows is that if we deliver schools at that larger size in the growth areas where the greatest demand is, we might be looking at more like 34 new schools needed over the next decade. And so that's a considerable difference, of course, compared to the business as usual size of schools, where we're going to need almost twice the number of new schools if we build them to the smaller number of students that we have been historically. The fifth scenario looks at a bit of a combination of what we call comprehensive capacity. So what that really is about is both maximising the land on existing new schools to deliver more permanent and relocatable buildings on most schools, as well as building larger schools. That gets us to a much lower number of schools that are new that we need to deliver overall, just over 20. So there's a range then of new schools that we would need under these different scenarios. We do this scenario work not because it can get us a particular magic solution that's the one we must absolutely choose, but rather it gives us a sense of direction of choice that government can make and that informs our recommendations. And part of this flows through then to the costing of those scenarios, because what we see then is that there are billions of dollars at play of choice between which of these scenarios and pathways we take in how we deliver new schools. And so if we build more relocatable and permanent buildings on our existing school sites compared to business as usual, there's, $1.5 billion in savings that can be had. If we combine that with larger new schools, we're certainly getting a couple of billions of dollars savings. Interestingly, if we build a much lower number of schools, that's scenario 5, overall, because of the combined size of those schools and the additional relocatable buildings we'll need, there's not really big cost savings. And when we deliver only about 21 schools, we are concerned that students and their families might need to travel a longer distance than would really be convenient. So those are some insights where I would draw out from the scenario modelling that leads us to conclude that a combination of larger new schools plus expanding existing schools, but not building so few schools that students have got long distances that they have to travel, is the right mix in future planning of schools. And so that's led to the recommendations in the report that we make in relation to schools, where we're recommending that now is a great time for the Victorian Government, as it finishes its current tranche of new schools, to identify, well, what are those schools that it's going to expand and confirm the areas where they're going to deliver new schools. And what our work shows is that's likely to be in the north, the west and the southeast of Melbourne, where we're going to need those new schools. Then we need to be gearing up to fund the expansion and delivery of existing new schools, and that's looking between 35 and 60 new schools, depending upon the balance that government wants to strike between maximising the existing land, delivering bigger new schools, but not having students travel too far to get to those schools. But if we can expand the build capacity of schools and build larger schools, we will be saving billions of dollars that can be better invested in delivering a high quality education system. The last thing that the report looks at is the ways in which we can deliver schools in existing areas, because of course we are going to see, particularly in the more medium term, more growth of school demand in inner and middle Melbourne and perhaps some of our regional cities too. And so we look at the importance of multi-level schools, of schools sharing open space with councils and sports grounds so that we can give kids great open space access but also make the best use of existing schools. And also some of the multi-campus schools that we're already seeing being delivered in Melbourne, which give opportunities to make the best use of the land and the developing precincts that we have in the inner cities. So now let's move to talk about the TAFE sector, the third sector that we look at in this Learning for Life report. This is really important because there is strong demand for additional TAFE skills, and in particular we're seeing it in areas like construction and healthcare, and a growing need for skilled Victorians who are able to work in the energy transition that we're all gearing up for. And so that's why we've cast a particular eye on the amount of additional TAFE demand we're going to have over the next decade or so, but also geographically where that lies too. And as Llewellyn said in introducing this work, we found that there is pretty strong demand for additional TAFE floor space. Around 20% more is going to be expected to be needed if we're going to meet those demands for particularly construction and healthcare and energy transition workforce. And that's on top of some very welcome commitments that the government's recently made to deliver new campuses in Melton and Sunbury. And we estimate that we're going to need about 125,000 square metres more space in Melbourne's growth areas and around 50,000 more TAFE space, 50,000 square metres that is, of TAFE space in places like Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo and the Latrobe Valley. What's interesting about that, in addition to those raw numbers, is where that demand is. So what our work shows is that a lot of the demand is not always located where our TAFE campuses currently are. We find that while we have quite a lot of TAFE floor space in inner and outer and Middle Eastern Melbourne, actually a lot of the demand for that is in our growth areas of Melbourne and also our regional cities as well. So that gives us some insights about where we need to be expanding our TAFE facilities in the future. The other thing we've done is actually talk to people who are currently or planning to engage in TAFE studies. And we surveyed around 4,000 households and to get some insights into this, as well as mapping public transport accessibility to TAFE sites. And what we found on public transport accessibility is that putting aside some of those inner Melbourne campuses, which are well serviced by public transport, many of the other regional and outer metro TAFEs really don't have very good public transport accessibility. And that's concerning because a lot of the people who will be students for TAFEs are going to be the sort of people who are going to need to use public transport to get there. The thing that tells us then is that when we're thinking about expanding TAFE campuses and improving public transport connections in our growth areas and regional cities, that we need to be lining up the location of those TAFEs and the public transport services we have. When we looked at the barriers and heard from those 4,000 households about what they were experiencing in terms of accessing TAFE, some of the barriers weren't infrastructure related. So some of them were about fitting study around other commitments like work or childcare, or their perception around the cost of TAFE courses being high. We certainly also saw that people who are in the middle and outer western regions do have less accessibility and struggle more to actually physically get to TAFE campuses. So there's a few insights there in addition to public transport accessibility. Things like co-location of childcare and kindergartens on TAFE, which some TAFEs are already starting to do, are part of the real synergies we can have between our early childhood education and our TAFE education and improving accessibility for all people who are wanting to learn across their lives. So the recommendations we've made to the Victorian Government have been to expand the TAFE campuses in Melbourne's west, north and southeastern growth areas and some of our regional centres, and in particular with a focus on training people in construction, energy and healthcare. Working with TAFE institutes, we've been able to identify some of the opportunities that seem to be good places to start in looking at where to expand those TAFEs. So, for example, there's strong need for additional TAFE delivery in Werribee. So strong, in fact, that it might be that a partnership between Victoria University and Gordon TAFE could be a combination to meet that strong demand. Looks like that Melbourne Polytechnic might want to look at a new campus in Craigieburn or that Calcalo corridor, that big northern growth corridor, where we're seeing very strong future population growth and demand for TAFE courses. Turning to the regions in Geelong and the Surf Coast, there may well be opportunity for the Gordon to expand their services there with additional TAFE facilities. So all of these are going to need some additional planning done and investment. And our estimate is over the next decade, there could be a couple of $1 billion of additional investment needed to deliver this TAFE floor space that's needed. At the same time, we could be better using land that TAFE or other government landholders have in some of these locations, and there could also be opportunities to find other uses for some of the TAFE campuses that are in locations that have lower demand on the basis of the modelling that we've done. So when we look across then, we can see the way in which we've got strong demand in our growth areas in the north, the west and the southeast for kindergarten schools and TAFEs, and then the Learning for Life report really draws out, what the quantum of that demand is, and has recommendations for government about the steps we need to take to meet that demand so that people have got good access to learning across their lifetime. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Jill, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what your questions are about this work.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for that flashback to the rickety old transportables that many of us endured in hot weather in Melbourne. Thank you for the questions that have come through. Please keep them coming. Just a reminder that the Slido link can be found on the website under the live stream. So a few questions. I'm just going to throw this one open. It's an interesting one to start us off. The work seems to rely heavily on granular long-term population projections, not just how many people, but their age, where they live, and when change happens. Historically, how accurate have these detailed population projections been, and how far ahead can we reliably plan? I'll throw that to you, Jonathan, but Llewellyn, of course, chime in as well.
Llewellyn may well want to add to this, as he led a lot of the work with the project team on doing this. The demography that we've used is the Victorian future estimates that the government issues. And we have certainly seen over time some variations, particularly in the totals that we see. And I mean, the most salient of that for all of us, of course, is the change we saw as a result of COVID, which certainly put a bump in our population growth. But when we look at what's underpinning demand for education, especially school and kindergarten, it's really pretty predictable, because we know that 3- and 4-year-old children and then those children going into school are going to be using these services. So that's a really good indicator. The other variance, which I did talk about earlier, of course, is the differences between historically where people have been choosing to settle and government's current policy efforts to have more housing located in established areas of Melbourne. While we think that is something that should be absolutely pursued, and it is, if you've seen our Choosing Victoria's Future work, there's lots of benefits in us actually seeking to have more people living in established areas. Even with that, the demand over the next decade for schools, kinders and TAFEs is still likely to be in those growth areas. Now, Llewellyn, you might want to dive in a little bit more to some of that modelling that we've done, and I know you've got views on the accuracy or otherwise of population estimates.
Look, and it's a really good question, because population projections are not perfect, and we cannot perfectly predict the future. Nonetheless, with all types of infrastructure, part of, I guess, our message as an organisation is good planning sets up Victoria for a much better and also more cost-effective future. While obviously plans need to be revised and we need to update our projections over time, if we're looking ahead 10, 20 years and thinking about what the future might look like, what we might need at those points, and having those plans in place so people understand, firstly, what the plans are, and secondly, we can take action now to actually minimise the cost of future. What we have seen in all sorts of infrastructure sectors, whether we're talking transport or energy or social infrastructure sectors like health and education, is when we've thought really short term and just kind of waited till the last second, till the problems got really bad to do something, it becomes very expensive for governments to act, and sometimes the result is, I guess, a suboptimal outcome, that we have to make choices that are more expensive and not as good because we haven't thought long term ahead enough to what we might need in the future. So we as an infrastructure strategy body very much promulgate looking ahead, understanding that the projections aren't going to be 100% perfect. And we know particularly, education for kindergarten and schools is very dependent on where people decide to live, when they decide to have children. And they can vary, particularly at the local scale, sometimes quite a lot. But if we're thinking long term and have plans in place, we can evolve them over time, but we keep our options open to get the best outcome for the future, rather than just reacting to pressures as they happen. And often that means an expensive, not very good option has to be chosen.
I might just add something to that, actually, because they're really good points, Llewellyn. So we're setting up for what are the key choices that government needs to make. And they're choices about cost, but they're also choices about delivery of services in a timely way and in a really accessible way. The other piece that Llewellyn alluded to is that sort of work informs what others do too. So if we can be clear in our planning about what the Victorian Government's intending to invest in and where it's intending to, that allows, private and not-for-profit school providers or kindergarten providers to do their work as well, and to do that with a greater level of confidence when they invest. And also, full credit to our colleagues in the Department of Education. They have sophisticated models and estimates, and they are very frequently updating their estimate at a much more fine-grained local level around school demand and kindergarten demand to help do that too. And so that's one of the ways in which any variations to future demand get picked up through that more fine-grained estimation and modelling that the department does.
So we've got a follow-up question from Joel. Thank you, Joel. I understand the focus on growth areas as we play catch-up, but if the government somehow manages to achieve its desired densification levels in inner middle suburbs around transport nodes, I think they're called activity centres, will that change the economics of our forecast?
I'd love to talk about that. Because we've looked at this, particularly in some of our urban work earlier, looking at different scenarios of how Melbourne could grow. And one of the things we see becomes very clear through that work is, certainly in the short term, in the next 10 years, because urban change happens very slowly, we don't see a lot of change in the immediate term. And that goes to understanding that you might have population growth in a place. It's not always growth in the school age population or the kindergarten age population. So you have to layer on the demographic change in those places, as well as just, are there more people living in them? And one of the things we see with densification, particularly in its early stages, it's often families without children moving into those places, and perhaps even the demolition of larger homes which might previously have had families in them. So the demand for education infrastructure sometimes comes quite a bit later than the new population in an area. Contrast that to growth areas where our projections are showing the biggest demand, which is often places where young families move, or indeed young couples move to begin families. So these projections are reasonably resilient over the next 10 years. When you look out further and you start looking at increasing density, those numbers start to shift a bit. So beyond kind of 10 years or so, and we've got a little bit of time to assess how we track towards densification, we may need to focus more on some of the suggestions we've made about alternative models of school and planning for greater numbers of kinders, schools and even TAFEs in more central locations.
And just a follow-up question on that, Llewellyn, how sensitive are our scenarios to major changes in immigration policy at a federal level? and the follow-on impacts on where, when, and at what volume new migrants settle?
It's a really good question, and once again, the answer is they're pretty resilient to that, because what we know about new migrants is they're generally not children, they're mostly young adults, and it will be some time generally before they have children. So once again, in the next decade, we're really talking about children who've already been born and are living in Victoria, or indeed the children of people who are already here. So the demand for education infrastructure, particularly kindergarten and school infrastructure, again, has quite a bit of lag after the general population grows. So it's unlikely that cuts to migration will affect these numbers very much in the short term. I guess the longer term is quite a different story.
Thanks, Will. And we've got a couple of questions here, both on schools and kindergarten. So I'll start with the questions on schools. What research has been done on school sizes affecting learning outcomes?
It's a really interesting question. We looked at this, and we also, the other thing we looked at actually was relocatable buildings. And whether there was any evidence around them affecting educational outcomes. And the short answer is there isn't strong evidence that school sizes, so larger school sizes versus smaller, or evidence that portable versus or relocatable versus permanent classrooms have any difference in educational outcomes. There's a whole body of research out there around what affects school outcomes, and a lot of it seems to be driven more by quality of teaching and quality of curriculum, and also some of the family and parental factors. Those things seem to be driving educational outcomes in a much more profound way than school sizes or the types of classrooms. They probably marginally make a difference. But of course, what this work focuses on is making sure that we've got enough schools in the right locations, so at least they're accessible and convenient for our growing population. That's really important. And then that is a particular gap then when we come to kindergartens, because we have some areas, particularly in regional Victoria, where there's a real risk that kindergartens won't be delivered. We have already got what's called childcare deserts in some areas of regional Victoria, so we don't want those to persist, and they're some of the areas we think Victorian Government really needs to focus its investment, because those childcare deserts might be places where private not-for-profit sector don't deliver. So that's really what the focus of this work is, in part because, there isn't strong evidence about school sizes or affecting educational outcomes.
And just a clarification question here, Jonathan. Won't more portable classrooms mean less outdoor space for play and exercise for children?
Yeah, that's a great question. And those of you who are friends of the show and have been following along will know, of course, that we last year published work on opening up of school grounds for community use. So we think there is very important opportunities to make sure that school students, when they're at school, and communities outside of school hours have access to open space on school grounds. So that is one of the limitations that we've placed upon the modelling that we've done. So when we've looked at increasing the number of permanent or relocatable buildings on existing school grounds, there's been a limit that we've placed in that modelling so that we don't remove all of the play space, outdoor space, green space, sporting fields on these schools. And that, we think, is really important, and it's a real trade-off. That's likely to be a trade-off that happens in that those scenarios you've seen about the number of schools we have, because we don't want to take too much of the existing school grounds and leave them without open space. And then when we come to some of the inner Melbourne schools and in the medium term their growth needs, we certainly want to retain as much of their open space as we can, but also make smart use of other open space that's around. So make sure that if we are expanding school campuses in inner areas of our cities, that we're using and sharing on a fair and agreed basis with local government parks and sporting facilities that might exist as well.
And just another question on schools before we move on to kindergartens. Have you also looked at building larger schools by catering to P10 rather than only primary and secondary? So I guess a longer and broader range of year levels covered.
I don't think we modelled that, did we, in that way, did we, Llewellyn? And it's certainly an option, and we certainly see it in some of the inner city schools. Yeah. Yeah,
and for the purpose of the modelling, no. But those, I guess, the scenarios that we modelled kind of give us some of the extremes of the options that you could do. There's obviously many options for how you might structure schools, but they don't really change the number of classrooms that you need. You can divide those up in different ways, and, you know, another example would be having a P to 10 school of a kind of in-between size, which the numbers would turn out about the same as what we modelled, for example. So those options are there, and certainly our modelling doesn't contradict that, but that's not the precise scenario that we modelled.
So looking at kindergartens, given government is effectively the sole funder of service delivery in kindergartens, what policy or funding settings should government put in place to encourage non-government investment in new kindergartens? I'll throw to you first, Llewellyn.
Sure. And so there are a range, and indeed government already has in place things like the building block grants and its own announcements about some of its initial investments in kindergarten infrastructure. And part of the challenge here is government, you know, learning to facilitate a market using a range of mechanisms. And I guess the first one we've talked about, rather than purely financial incentives, is also those information and confidence mechanisms about the market, having really good information about where demand is coming from, where demand is likely to come, and giving them the confidence to invest without subsidies in the first instance in new infrastructure. Now, different sectors probably do need different levels of support. Traditionally, we haven't given a lot of subsidy to, say, for-profit providers, but we have traditionally given some subsidies to not-for-profit providers, or indeed sometimes local governments. So there's a mix of incentives that are available through this transition, and we modelled, you know, some level of support for different sectors when we developed those costings. But the challenge, I think, for governments is, in the first instance, trying to maximise the participation and the contribution of other sectors by giving them as much information and confidence that if they make those investments, they're likely to see the financial return from the participation of children in those programs.
And a follow-up on the research. How did we distinguish between the demand for kindergartens and the demand for long daycare services? And particularly interested, given the I think you called them childcare deserts that exist.
It's a really good point, and something we spend a lot of time digging into. So what the modelling did is it presumed that current utilisation of long day care would be available for children to transition into. So we're very aware of the substitutability between long day care and kindergarten programs, and we didn't count new demand for kindergarten if that demand was currently being fulfilled by long day care providers. So this is additional demand beyond the current participation of 3 and 4 year olds to the levels announced by government in long day care programs. So we were very careful to not double count and be providing infrastructure for the same kids to participate in 2 different programs at the same time. We stripped that out of the modelling to just count additional demand for kinder that couldn't be accommodated by existing long day care.
And another question on the research. Did you do any research on teacher numbers required for this increased demand for schools?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no, we didn't. The need for development of both teaching workforce and that's through kinder, school and TAFE, of course, is really important. And there are a number of efforts being taken by government to incentivise people entering into those very rewarding careers. Because we're Infrastructure Victoria, our focus, of course, was on the infrastructure that's required in the future. We certainly need to make sure that we have teaching workforce to work in that future schools, in kinders and TAFEs. Where there's a real crossover, of course, is in the different costs it's going to take to deliver that future infrastructure. Because when we're talking about billions of dollars of potential savings, depending upon how that future infrastructure is delivered, for every dollar we're saving, that's a dollar that is then in play to be invested in a different way in our education system for more teachers and to make their teaching experience better, for better services and support to students and better facilities in terms of operating those schools and kinders and TAFE. So that's where the crossover is. What we haven't done is any fine-grained modelling or assessment around future workforce needs.
And a question here on the scenarios for kindergartens. From the scenarios, how many kindergartens are you actually saying the government needs to build?
Well, part of the reason we took a scenario approach is because it depends. And it depends on how much the government can facilitate private sector engagement. So we don't make a clear recommendation. We haven't kind of done an assessment of, well, how likely is the private sector to invest? The short answer to the question is the more the government can get the private sector or the not-for-profit sector to contribute to those costs, and indeed local government, the fewer it will have to build itself. We certainly think there's a strong case for government to build in areas where that's unlikely to happen. And we know both from work done by the Productivity Commission and the historical pattern is that the private and not-for-profit sectors are less likely to invest in places with very disadvantaged populations. And our first priority would be for the government to really focus its investment in those kind of areas and leave as much room as possible for others to invest in perhaps areas where the participation and affordability of kindergarten programs would be greater when delivered by the private sector.
And we have time for one final question, and that was relating to the growth areas which we've spoken about. How much of the demand for schools and kindergartens is in the growth areas and where?
I'm happy to talk to that, Jill. So lots of it is the answer, right? So as I sort of talked to in presenting some of that work, so around 95% of the future schools demand is in those growth areas, and we've got really strong demand as well for the kinders in growth areas as well. So that is a very clear message that comes out of this work, is that it is the north, the west and the southeast of Melbourne, those growth areas where there is the greatest demand. And then we need to keep an eye and not forget the areas of growth in our regional areas, whereas particularly our regional cities, where there's some growth in school demand. And certainly, as I talked about, there is a bit of a disconnect between current demand for TAFE and where TAFE students want to go and where our TAFE campuses are currently located. So this is a very strong growth area story, at least over the next decade. And then, as Llewellyn was talking about, when we get beyond the next decade, depending on how we go in terms of having more compact cities and more of our population growing in our established areas in Melbourne and our regional cities, that could mean that some of that growth is shifting from the growth areas to our established areas a little bit more.
Thanks, Jonathan. And that's all we have time for. So thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's webinar. Thank you to Jonathan and Llewellyn for their insights into our most recent research. I'd like to encourage you to respond to the poll, which is now live under the video link on the website. It helps us to deliver better webinars in the future. So very grateful for your insights as well. And that's all we have time for. Thank you.